of social inhibition when the society concerned doesn't want to know what it is that you have to say. And it situates the phenomenon of stuttering or stammering in a kind of intermediary position as being a product of both of those kinds of pain. Product of trauma, but a product also of the difficulty of witnessing. And so if there's an equivocation going on here, it's an equivocation over what stammering means, but it may not be an equivocation. It may be simply a generalization of what it means to stammer. So let me just indulge in a few generalities to begin with. Then I'll talk about the generic issues. Then I'll try and hone in a little bit onto this question of pain. And then, by then we'll have had a break, I'm presuming. Then I'd like to look more closely at what regeneration has to say about war poetry, the poetry of the Great War, and in particular the work of Sassoon, and more particularly still Wilfred Owen. Look briefly at one poem of Wilfred Owen's, the one that's featured in here, so to speak, and then try to draw some tentative conclusions about why it was that witnessing in England in this period ended up happening in lyrical genres. How can we account for that particular phenomenon? Okay, so stuttering and stammering are interesting to me because you have to use two words to. The English language provides two words, and they go together, so to speak. They form their own stutter or their own stammer in a sense, and it's kind of a semantic stutter or a stammer because yes, they do mean the same thing. B, there's a difference between stuttering emphasizes, if you like, the explosive character of pronunciation when this phenomenon occurs, and stammering puts the emphasis more on the intermittency of the pronunciation and its interruptiveness, if you like. But either of them, I think, and therefore both of them, can be understood as an explosive response to the violence of inhibition. I'm going to use the word inhibition rather than repression, although I'm not really sure what the technical difference between those two is. And both of them, I think, are describable as a speech deficiency, if you like, that is also an eloquent sign that functions or can function as if it was a trope. So I'm asking you to imagine that there's, as far as I know, no Greek word for this, although there probably was a Greek word for stuttering and stammering. I'm asking you to imagine that an orator might, perhaps even deliberately, adopt a stutter or stammer for rhetorical purposes. Perhaps mention with some difficulty the word death, right? And do that not as a pathology of speech, but as a rhetorical device, so to speak. That's what I'm basically trying to get at here. Regeneration uses what was a widespread phenomenon, particularly among the middle class in England, this phenomenon of stuttering, stammering, in relation to the trauma of trench warfare in 1914-18, but also in relation to the repression of that trauma that was going on at home. The the unwillingness and inability to acknowledge the horror of the trench warfare. And it's mainly interested in the repression. It's mainly interested in the home scene. We use that repression as being intense. So intense that certain of the characters in the trilogy, Siegfried Sassoon in Regeneration, but also Billy Cryer in the third novel, The Ghost Road, end up preferring France, the trench war in France, to the pain of England, pain that's inflicted on them in England. So that if you want to read it as orthodox witnessing in relation to the war, something that might correspond to more contemporary accounts like Eric Remarque's Quiet on the Western Front, Henri Barbuse's Le Feu, then you have to do that by indirection. It's talking about the trauma of the front by talking about the intensity with which that trauma is repressed back home in England. I think you can do that. It's probably the standard reading of the book, which uses the hospital, Craiglockhart in Scotland, where young officers cured, or at least an attempt is made to cure young officers of their war neurosis, what we nowadays call post-traumatic stress disorder, and sent back to the war. It uses that hospital as a kind of figure for England itself, right? England is one vast mental hospital that's in the business of taking sane people who demonstrate their sanity by being made neurotic by trench warfare, takes sane people, baptizes their sanity craziness, cures it, and sends them back. Right? That's the paradoxical situation that the novel is about. So England is a place where it's crazy to be sane about the war, whereas France is a place where it's perfectly sane to be made crazy by the war. Right? So Regeneration is therefore an ironic title, quite clearly, I think. But it's also unironic, and it's the unironic sense that's perhaps most interesting, because it's suggesting that England, that the war period in England was regenerative, in the sense that the country, in response to this great stress, the country is beginning to cure itself of its inhibitory social structures, of its repressions. And it also suggests that that process of regeneration, of curing itself, is a process of great pain, and it does that largely through the very central anecdote of the research done by Dr. Head, H-E-A-D, who first of all severed a nerve of his own, and so it's a self-inflicted pain, and then measured the progress of recovery of that severed nerve in terms of how painful it was. Right? And so there's a sort of central metaphor there about the pain attached to such a society. That seems as a story about England's beginning to come to terms with its own inhibitory social structures. It tells the story, on the one hand, of a failed political act of witness, which is Siegfried Sassoon's attempt through his famous declaration, an attempt which gets suppressed basically by treating him as ill when he's not, because, as the book says, quote, the casualty lists are too terrible to admit of any public debate on the continuation of this war. political suppression of Sassoon's attempted witness. That's the first side of it. But also, the other side of the regenerative process is the emergence of war poetry, Sassoon's poetry, and Wilfred Owen's, as what I would call not a political but as a cultural act of witness, or mode of witness, that, as we know, turned out to be capable of eluding the censorship and achieving some kind of an audience, although most of it, to be honest, was not achieved until the war was well over. Some of that poetry was being published in 1917 and 1918 already. Sassoon brought out a volume which was received with some scandal, but was nevertheless read. Mentioned syphilis in it, and that was definitely a no-no, but got through. So I'm interested in this phenomenon of getting through, what you might call cultural infiltration, that poetry turns out to be capable of doing, whereas the declaration failed. But I'm also interested in the way poetry like Wilfred Owen's in particular can be read as an attempt to introduce the rhetorical trick of stuttering or stammering into what shall we say, into the state of Edwardian English poetry as it was in the year 1913. Still quite Keatsian, and when it wasn't Keatsian, it was Tennysonian, and when it wasn't Tennysonian, it was perhaps Kipling-esque. So we're dealing, in the case of some of this poetry, and we're dealing with something that you might call a kind of controlled stammer, a stammer that functions as a kind of intended error introduced into iambic pentameter, the sonnet form, all of those kind of things, a bit like my imagination of an orator who would deliberately stammer at some point in order to make a rhetoric, in order to achieve a rhetorical. Okay, the generic issues, I assume you'd agree that they have to do with the fact that Pat Barker is hijacking fiction for the purposes of an act of witness, and hijacking historical fiction in particular. And that, the question of fiction, immediately raises the issues implied by what I call the folk theory of witnessing as being only really valid when it's immediately referential, when an eyewitness is able to report in the I form on experience that the eyewitness in both spellings of the word I, can claim to have personally had. Pat Barker, on the other hand, if we're looking at the author here, the writing subject, is writing about experiences and events that took place long before she was born, right? She couldn't possibly have been involved in any of them. So she's writing about history in the colloquial sense of the word history. You know, when people say, your history, right? You know, she's writing about something that's behind her. And on top of that, she's writing about them fictionally, which I will describe for the moment as an anti-historical genre. History doesn't like to think of itself as being fictional, although a few brave historians have tried to point out to them that historiography is no less fictional than any other form of writing. There's an interesting event that took place in Paris in July of last year, when Lucie Aubrac and her husband Pierre Aubrac, I think, were brought together with a group of historians by the newspaper Libération. And that happened because Lucie Aubrac, in particular, and her husband Pierre, had been, ever since the 1980s, very busy as a witnessing something, writing about Vichy France, and the resistance to the German occupation, in which she and her husband had been, at the age of 20 or 21 or so, had been very adventurously involved. Her husband had been arrested with Jean Moulin in Lyon. Lucille Bach had dressed up as a rich woman and gone to Gestapo headquarters and said, in order to find out whether her husband was still alive, and said, "I'm pregnant. There's this guy," cited his other resistance name, who promised marriage, and now he's been arrested. What's going to happen? How can I go back to my family, etc., etc. And was actually granted a brief interview in which Pierre Robert was dragged into the room and confronted with her and asked whether he was willing to marry her. So he knew that she had been made. Anyway, eventually she and her resistance friends got together, rescued him from the Gestapo, and they escaped to England. The book that she wrote about this, it was called Il Partiront dans l'ivresse. A film was made of it. It became a great success. Immediately began to be attacked from the right. It was attacked on the grounds of historical inaccuracy or implausibility, and attacked too with the speculation that Pierre Robert may have been the guy who sold Jean Moulin to the Gestapo. So it became necessary for the historians to meet with Robert. And what happened was extraordinary, because anybody who's read that book, Partiront dans l'ivresse, recognise it as being a witness of the truth, but sees that it's very contrived. In particular, it occupies and pretends to be journal, to be derived from a journal, which of course no one kept a journal in the resistance in 1942. And it's structured chronologically in terms of the famous pregnancy. It deals with a 9-month period. The kid was born the day after they arrived in England by one of those bitty planes which used to fly across the channel. So it's a literary construct, neither fiction nor history, if you like. And the historians could not understand that. Historians were saying there do indeed seem to be either factual inaccuracies or things that don't fit in the story. Was it possible to walk into the Gestapo headquarters without any, just walk into Gestapo headquarters? Lucille Bach's response to that was, listen, it was a crazy period. There were no rules. We didn't know, if there were rules, we didn't know what they were. We did our best. Right? And that's what she's witnessing to, the nature of that period. The historians were saying, gee, but you might have been followed when you left the Gestapo. And, you know, the particular sting in that tale was that Pierre Robach's, his real name was Solomon, I think. Something like that, clearly Jewish name. Had, a few months later, been arrested and deported and died in Auschwitz. The historians will say, listen, you could have been followed. They could have followed you, discovered that your real name was Madame Solomon, teaching at the lycée in Lyon, and so you may be responsible for the death of Pierre Robert. You know, it was really nasty stuff. And what was really interesting was that the Robachs had no response to that. They didn't know how to defend themselves against the accusation of factual error. So here's the problem, okay? Witnessing is about the truth, but it doesn't define the truth necessarily in terms of the facts, all right? It's interested in truths other than the facts. It's a speculative form of truth, or if you like, an interpretive form of truth. And so the witnessing that's going on in a generation, in my opinion, is speculative, because it's dealing with an area where, you know, the factuality scarcely applies, because it's interested in the conditions of what it's bearing witness to is the pain of the conditions of emergence of acts of witness. Okay, how can you be factual about pain? the conditions of emergence as they're exemplified by the contrast between Sassoon's straightforward statement, his declaration, which got politically suppressed, and, in my opinion, the poetry understood, of course, you can see me coming here, as a generic catechesis, a making do, turning Edwardian poetry into a vehicle for representing trench warfare and thus making it stammer and stuff. Okay, let's skip a bit here in the interest of time. Let's go straight into this issue of pain now, and the relation of pain and stammering and stuttering. Nearly all the characters in the novel suffer from some kind of symptom, and often a speech symptom. They can't speak at all, or they stutter or stammer. But the characters who are interesting from the point of view of re-theorising this phenomenon of stammering are most particularly Siegfried Sassoon himself and the psychotherapist, neither a psychoanalyst nor a psychiatrist, but something in between, or something more than both, perhaps. Rivers is his name, historical figure, who was an early anthropologist. In fact, in the days when anthropology meant doing a lot more than doing ethnographies and facts you can read in the library and so on. The re-theorising of the stammer through the figures of Sassoon and Rivers as not so much as a symptom of war neurosis as the symptom of what Rivers very early in the piece, page 15, calls an anti-war neurosis. Okay? How do you get from a war neurosis with stammering as its symptom to stammering as the sign of health, the sign of an anti-war neurosis? So the novel's doing some re-theorising, and perhaps more particularly, it's understanding stuttering and stammering as the product of a bind, the famous double bind, not invented by Gregory Bateson, described, articulated by Gregory Bateson. A bind in which the desire and the ethical necessity of speaking the truth encounters a social apparatus that censors the speaking of the truth. And that censors that, and here's the crucial point, it does that censoring not by prohibiting speech. The people are already not talking, they're talking very inefficiently. Not by prohibiting speech, but by enforcing certain modes of speech. So the bind is how to speak the truth when, in the social context, modes of speaking are enforced that don't accommodate the truth. Now, phrased that way, you have a kind of model of what I was describing in terms of genre a couple of weeks back, right? The idea that any given culture has at its disposal a certain array of genres which make possible, in the framework of which certain things can be said but other things cannot be said without solecism, without error, such that there is a sort of surplus to the genre array. Well, the same thing applies here, but in more like layperson's terms. It's described about trying to speak when speech is regulated in ways that don't allow for the saying of the truth that you need to say. And that bind is figured not by Sassoon and Rivers in this case, but by Sassoon on the one hand, and Rivers' alter ego, another doctor, his name is Dr. Yelland, Y-E-A-L-L-A-N-D. Sassoon is very early established in the novel. Sassoon is a person who talks sense about the war. That's his friend Robert Graves' opinion. Expressed on page 23, reinforced by the poems of Sassoon's that are cited a little bit later. And I think enacted in his declaration. His declaration is talking sense, straightforward. Dr. Yelland works in a London hospital, and we see an episode towards the end of the novel in which he cures a soldier who is mute. His name is Callan. But he does it by applying a kind of counter-trauma. Right? The soldier has war neurosis, can't talk. Yelland applies, I find myself stammering while trying to describe this, applies high voltage electric shocks to extremely sensitive parts of Yelland's mouth and throat. In other words, to torture. As a way of bringing Callan out of his mutism. And it works. It works. But the condition laid down by Yelland is not, well, he does say, you must speak. Right? That's what he's got to do. But the condition is that he must speak and say which is basically thank you, sir. Right? He puts it in a rather odd way. You must speak, but I shall not listen to anything you have to say. You must speak, but I shall not listen to anything you have to say. Which can only mean you must speak, but if you want to say something that you want to say, that's not what I want to hear. Okay? I shall not listen. Sassoon trying to talk sense versus Yelland applying a counter-trauma to cure symptoms of war neurosis. And Rivers, the humane therapist, ends up recognizing himself in Dr. Yelland. Rivers is admitted to witnessing the scene of Callan's alleged cure, well, an actual cure, I suppose. He sees it in part through a dream as being a version of his own psychiatric practice. The difference between the two being only one of method. The result is the same. Rivers is curing people of their neurosis so that they can go back to the war. So is Yelland. Yelland is getting better results than Rivers, but they're both engaged in the same game. There's no comparison in the amount of pain inflicted. On the face of it, this is Rivers in his dream, seemed to be congratulating himself on dealing with patients more humanely than Yelland. But then, why the mood of self-accusation? In the dream, he stood in Yelland's place. The dream seemed to be saying in dream language, don't flatter yourself, there is no distinction, etc., etc. You can read all of that here, pages 237, 238. Okay, so, two kinds of pain. The pain of trauma, the pain of being cured of the trauma in the sense of being obliged to speak not what it is that you have to say, but what it is that people want to hear. And that bind is itself comparable to the situation of men at the war who found themselves aloft in observation balloons, particularly nasty position to be in because you were exposed to gunfire and there's nothing you could do about it. You could neither take cover nor fire back. So once an observation balloon was observed, it was fairly easy to observe, you just had to stay there as long as you could, trying to make your observations when people took pot shots at you and hoping that they would miss until you got down again, if you did get down. Rivers explicitly compares that situation of young men in observation balloons with what he calls the anxiety disorders and hysterical neuroses suffered by women in peacetime. Sense of helplessness, I'll give you the quotation, prolonged strain, immobility and helplessness. So war neurosis, as tried, turns out to be, in many senses, comparable with disorders of anxiety and hysteria that were being diagnosed in women at the time because of a similarity of origin. Social origin in the case of women, or related origin in the case of the men. Same bind. The bind of the inability, the bind of impotence, the bind of having something forced on you that you can't do anything about. And the novel also invites us to compare the situation of women in peacetime England, as it was so described, with that of the two minority groups that Siegfried Sassoon represents, that is to say Jews and homosexuals in the same period. All of them controlled. Gregory Bateson's great point about the double bind is that it is a socially controlling mechanism. It makes people docile, to put them. So, in the end, that kind of controlling double bind perhaps extends to the whole population, because Rivers himself ends up, when he's thinking about the relation between Dr. Yelland and himself, Rivers himself ends up saying, well, you know, it's not our fault. We are controlled too. Even though they're functioning as the agents of the controlling mechanisms of the society, they also are controlled agents. The familiar paradox of cultural agency, of course. So the kind of equivocation that prevails in the novel about trauma, is the trauma war trauma, or is the trauma social trauma back home in England, rests on that sort of a general observation that what makes people neurotic is this situation of impetus, prolonged strain, immobility, helplessness, inability to say what it is that you have to say because the means aren't available, is like the position of women, Jews, homosexuals, who similarly are unable to be themselves because of the situation in which they find themselves, which is itself like manning an observation. Okay, got it. Now those ideas are worked through through a kind of technique of intertwining case studies, I suppose would be one way of describing the way this novel works. There's a film about regeneration that's just been made, and I was lucky enough to catch it when I was in England recently. I'm assuming it will hit these shores before too long. Made by a Scottish director whose name is Ilias McKillop, I believe. A very interesting film cinematographically because it's shot in near darkness most of the time. This is September, October, November in Scotland, so the sun rises, it's even lower than it is here, the sun rises above the horizon, it sets again immediately, you know, and at night, it's 1917, at night they have electricity in the hospital, but they're using, 3-watt bulbs or something like that, so you spend your time kind of peering through the murk all the time in this film, but the film itself picks up very much on this case study understanding of what the novel's about.
Is it regeneration as well?
It's called Regeneration. Yeah, you won't be able to miss it when it arrives. Good question. Okay, what are some of the stories, some of the major stories? First of all, the one that I want to mention first, Pryor, Billy Pryor, working class man who's become an officer, suffers mutism, not stuttering, because he's a working class man. only officers, only the officer class stutters and stammers. But the story of what triggers his neurosis is absolutely crucial to understanding this book. I think because it turns out to be, when finally it's uncovered, that he found himself picking up the pieces after somebody had been killed by a shell right next to him, and by his foot an eye, a human eye, which he picked up. And the last thing that he remembers saying is, what am I supposed to do with this gobstopper? What am I supposed to do with this gobstopper? Now, what interests me about that is this onomatopoeic thing about stammer and stutter works with back vowels, R or R, right? Stir, and T in this case, and double consonants. Okay? So at the other end, with front vowels and closed vowels, you can think about titter and twitter, maybe tittle. I'm not sure about the only there, like in my theory. Now, if you were going to invent a word that would fit between these back vowels and these front vowels, you might well come up with stopper. Right? It's the same onomatopoeic structure, if you like. And a gobstopper is onomatopoeic in the sense that it's imitating the sensation of a mouthful, right? I see a few eyebrows raised, that's good. Gobstopper was also a candy of the period, a round, large candy, which of course children put right into their mouth, and it did stop their gobs. Okay. Yes.
I'm just wondering for more obvious reading that is Gab stopper, but Gab is speaking, because it was listed as
Yeah.
Gab stopper.
So if you want. Sure, absolutely. I'll take anything that more or less supports this particular view of mine. I'm guessing that those two words are etymologically related anyway. They're both Old French, I think.
Of course, in England, gob is
yeah, that's right.
shut your gob.
But those vowels, if someone whose name is Ross and is always called Russ, my name is R-O-S-S and I'm always called R-U-S-S in the United States, that particular group of vowels shifts a heck of a lot in one dialect. So I'll go with all of that stuff, Anyway, I want to point to the now let's get back to serious literary stuff as opposed to fancy here. I want to point to the relation between the eye and the stopping of the gob. And then to do that seriously, we'd need to read the next volume in the trilogy, which is called The Eye in the Door. The Eye in the Door is a figure for the surveillance under which pacifists in particular were put in England in this period, but it's a general figure for the repression of the working class and the repression of generalized repression of women, all those things. Okay, so there's Frye's trauma, is the trauma of having his gob stopped, right, by an eye, by a kind of panoptic eye, if you like. Next case study, Sassoon. Sassoon's decision, these are case studies in pain. This is the point that I'm wanting to make here, different modes of experiencing pain under the circumstances that I've been trying to outline. Sassoon has the pain of making the decision to return to his troops, return to the trenches, while nevertheless keeping open while nevertheless maintaining his sanity. That's to say, he can't admit that he was suffering a neurosis, because then from then on, anything that he may wish to say in the witnessing line will be immediately out of court. So he can't admit to having been cured, right? He nevertheless has to make the decision to return, partly under pressure from Rivers, and partly to his own guilt at having left his men behind and living in relative comfort and luxury and certainly safety in Craiglockharn. Then there's the study of Rivers. Rivers too is the subject of a case study because he evolves. He develops in the course of the novel. He develops a stammer of his own, mentioned around page 70, 69, 70, and then again page 97, and Frye picks up on that stammer. And he develops a stammer because he's in a bind too. His bind is that as a psychiatrist or a therapist, he's curing the sane. And he's curing the sane in complicity with the craziness of repression. That's the way his role is clarified with respect to Sassoon. Sassoon is clearly a sane man, not suffering from neurosis, although he stutters. But Rivers has been politically given the task of curing this man who is sane. And Rivers finally evolves until he achieves a kind of breakthrough, largely through the revelation of Dr. Yellen's methods and their similarity to his own. He ends up formulating his thoughts this way: a society that devours its own young deserves no automatic or unquestioning allegiance. Perhaps the rebellion of the old might count for more than the rebellion of the young. That's what he says when he realises that Sassoon is going back to France. Sassoon's rebellion has been, for the time being at least, staved off. Time for the old to take up the task. So, Frye, Sassoon, Rivers. Wilfred Owen's coming to poetry is part of the business of pain, too, coming to war poetry, because Wilfred Owen was a Keatsian, very young Keatsian, who, with encouragement from Sassoon and help from Sassoon, came to think of poetry as not a refuge. He'd originally defined it as a refuge, the opposite of the war, he says, on page 84. And begins to has to struggle to invent a form of poetic writing that, as he puts it, dares to face the facts. It's also page 84 to 85. I think a finer reading would distinguish between Sassoon and Owen. Sassoon's poetry is also declarative and relatively straightforward because it's satirical, it tends to be largely satirical and rather blunt in its ironies. Wilfred Owen, I think, is in the business of trying to invent a poetry of noise, a poetry of stammering that is not specifically satirical, but is witnessing instead. He has to do that in opposition to the general public discourse about warfare, which is jingoistic and optimistic and patriotic and completely uninformed as to the facts, what he calls the facts, right? And also in opposition to the prevailing genre of imperialistic war poetry, which has the Charge of the Light Brigade as one of its models, and certain Kipling pieces as another. A last case study I want to mention is the case study of the women, because I'm sure many of you are sitting here saying, "Where are the women? Where are the women?" Pat Parker is very interested in others of her novels. Pat Parker is very interested in women characters. In this book, she's interested in the vulnerability of men, which is, in my opinion, at least has as many feminist credentials as she has some interesting women characters too, particular working class women characters. And their story is the story of a partial release from inhibition and repression, thanks to the conditions of the war. And it's essentially economic conditions of the war. They can make much more money. But the women, there are three women, let me get their names right. There's Madge, there's Sarah, and there's Betty. The war for Madge means release from battery. Her husband goes to war and I think from memory gets killed. So she's released, if she wants it, permanently from being battered by the husband. Sarah becomes Billy Pryor's girlfriend, finds herself in financial control, sexually freer, released from the surveillance of her mother, etc., etc., able to have an affair with Billy Pryor. Betty's story is not so happy though, because she ends up getting pregnant, has a self-induced, tries to induce an abortion on herself with a coat hanger, and when last heard of, is to be a death, we presume. So the picture with women is a nuanced one, let's say, but it's generally a picture of the beginnings of a certain kind of regeneration. I think I'm going to stop at that point. I'm done with the question of pain, and about to move into the question of war poetry in more particular sense. So it's a good time to take a break. We'll have a tape to... So I was putting it to you that the novel is about two kinds of pain of trauma, the pain of witnessing the trauma. And it's asking the question about stammering. Is stammering just a symptom of the trauma, or is it also a response to the cultural bind is it just a war neurosis, and so a symptom of trauma, or is it an anti-war neurosis, and in that sense a response to the cultural bind that witnessing tries to elude. So, and I think the book's interest in war poetry has to do with the fact that you can understand poetry like Sassoon's, and particularly like Owen's, as being governed by that same equivocal situation in terms of that poetry's own stammering. You can read the poetry with its stammer as a response or a product of trench warfare, which is, after all, its referential subject matter. That's what it's about, right? But at the same time, you can read it as a kind of compromise formation that introduces the noise of war into the regulated language of the lyric. In other words, turns the lyric in the direction of warfare, so that it can face the facts. So you might say that the novel is readable as a speculation about the generative context out of which Wilfred Owen's poetry of witness actually arises. What are the components that are necessarily present for that poetry to occur? War is one of them, but another one is the influence of Sassoon, and another one is the relation between war as traumatic and the also traumatic social bind that the poetry has to negotiate, has to resolve in order to speak the war. It can't speak the war unless it resolves the social bind. In particular, there's a series of episodes when the novel shows us Sassoon and Owen meeting and talking about poetry, working together on a poem of Owen's after Owen takes it as his, makes the resolution to try to write war poetry as opposed to his previous poetic efforts. And I think that you can read that, saying to Pat in the break, I think that you can read those episodes as a narrativization of the struggle to find a language that's readable. You have it in your handout, in the various manuscript drafts of the Anthem for Doomed Youth that have survived, where you can see on the very first one in the handout, you can see a draft of the poem Anthem for Dead Youth in Wilfred Owen's handwriting, with annotations in the handwriting of Sassoon, right? But not annotations, changes, modifications, corrections. What Parson Bells is Owen's correction, for these who die so fast, only the monstrous anger of the guns replacing our guns. And what Pat Barker does is narrativize that change from our to thee by speculating about what the conversation would have been between the two, about the difference between the gun and our guns, what the difference of meaning would be. And she develops that narrative quite interestingly. I think it's describable, it's describable as the narrative of a struggle and therefore of a certain kind of pain. Struggle to find a language, and more particularly a struggle with something that I can't remember whether I've used this term of art before, what I call the fleur du mal syndrome. Have I used that term before? Oh, great. So nice when you still discover something in your hat still that you haven't really, exactly veiled in the decent obscurity of a foreign tongue, is it? But I'll write it up anyway. Mal syndrome. Okay. I'll talk more about fleur du mal syndrome next week when we're talking about Calgary. Probably. But I've already alluded to it. Remember when we were talking about Primo Levi's use of Dante in his Auschwitz memoir, if this is a man, and we'll encounter it in Calgary with respect in particular to the references to Baudelaire that are in that text, but also to Pascal Dedoux's very rather generous set of allusions to a whole lot of rather lush 19th century writing and 19th century music. I can't call it the fleur du mal syndrome because of the title fleur du mal, which I understand as identifying on Baudelaire's part a problem of modernity, which Baudelaire might well have formulated most of the time, because Baudelaire wavered on these issues like most people, as being how to take evil, let's say the ugly, how to take ugliness, which would include the obscene, and turn it into the beautiful. Okay? It's fair to say that it's simplified, in a simplified way, that what the fleur du mal is about is taking the pain of modernity and making poetry out of that pain. So one problem that's inherent in the fleur du mal syndrome is that how to make the inherited flowers of rhetoric, if you like, bespeak the particular evil, the particular pain that is associated with our modernity. Very much an issue when it comes to the war, obviously. This 1914-18 war was the first large-scale, major employment of modern technologies of warfare. There's another issue which is more modern, I think, in the fleur du mal syndrome, which goes the other way around. What's at stake in doing that, in representing the ugly, as Wilfred Owen calls it, in terms of the beautiful, which is its opposite, according to Owen. Right? What are you doing if your desire is to face the facts, or to write a poetry that faces the facts? If you have no option except to write the ugly in terms of that which is the opposite of the ugly. In other words, are you turning poetry into a refuge again, such that it doesn't adequately measure up to the ugliness of the facts? Do you have an option? How do you resolve that tension between the necessity of making the ugly beautiful so that it is sayable, and between betraying the ugliness of the ugly in making it beautiful? Okay, so that's what's, roughly speaking, included in the fleur du mal syndrome. Next day I'll get a bit more complicated about it and perhaps introduce a third point there, but that will do for now. We talked, apropos of Primo Levi, of the irony of that procedure, that it's a distinctly ironic procedure, that it relies on implication on the part of the text, or the writer of the text, or the subject of the text is the right phrase, right term. It implies on implication in the text, and therefore on a recognition and an acknowledgement on the part of the reading of the text. One has to be able to understand that poetry about the ugly is nevertheless about the ugly. You have to be able to read the ugly in the beauty of poetry and not understand that poetry has not understand that the poetry has beautified the ugly out of existence. So there's problem of incongruity, which is the third point that I'll make in more detail about Baudelaire and hopefully the next time. But we've already met it in the figures of Primo and his friend Jean, was it Henri? Jean, I think his name. Walking on their way to the soup, in the middle of Auschwitz, talking in subtle detail about the philological details of the Dante text that one of them doesn't know and that the other one can only half remember. Here in this novel, you get something very similar in the way of an irony of incongruity in the picture of these two poets fussing over words, asking themselves in great detail which words in the English language most accurately represent the sounds of trench warfare, of modern warfare, industrialised modern racket, right? So it's about beauty of sound in poetry and the racket of war, but it's also about these two people trying to write a poetry of war, do something therefore extremely important, but finding themselves, of course, engaged in what to many people would look like, many people who aren't in comparative literature, would look like a rather trivial point. Is herds the right word for those who are dying, or is as cattle the right way of putting it, right? And why? Is our guns or the guns the right way? Dancing on the point of the so that incongruity arises because they are struggling with the fleur du mal syndrome. That's the point. Right? And that's where the pain arises in specific terms. Yeah. When you look at the poem itself, the anthem, which you have on the front of the handout, Anthem for Doomed Youth. Okay, here it is in its final version, definitive. Well, probably not definitive, but the final version, the version that was the last one that Owen left. What passing bells for these should die as cattle, only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs, wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all, not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient mind, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. I'm inclined to think this poetry is rather tame stuff for contemporary readers. I don't know whether you share my feeling that we're more sensitive to its Edwardianness than we are to its adventurousness. It's not Apollinaire. It's Keatsianness, yes. Thank you, I'm glad I didn't. Thank you, Pat. I'll slip Pat $5. So we have to make an effort of imagination here in order to understand why it was such a struggle for someone like Owen to write an iambic pentameter sonnet, perfectly formal, right? But to permit himself the odd slant rhyme, guns and orisons. And to imitate in the poetic structure the monstrous anger, with words like cattle, stutter, rattle, patter, and so on, shrill, demented choirs, wailing shrill, and so on. That's as far as he could go in the direction of introducing the noise of war, introducing a stutter into the language of poetry. But it was far enough in contemporary terms. That was itself, as effective, rhetorically effective, as much more vivid and graphic methods would now be. So he's carrying war, if you like, the subject matter of war, into, I suppose, the genre of the elegy, right? It's what we can describe it as, anthem for doomed youth, would seem to suggest an elegy, and the passing bells would be the figure for the elegy. How can one write an elegy for these who die as cattle, right? The words orisons and choir are there to anchor the metaphor that carries war into the elegy. Using metaphor in its etymological sense, the metaphor is carrying something into something. It's carrying war into elegy. Here, because orisons and choirs are made to apply on both sides. Orisons and choirs belong in the vocabulary of elegy, but in this case they're made to be part of the vocabulary of the war. The only orisons that are available for these who die as cattle are the orisons of the stuttering rifles, rapid rattle, the orisons of war, and the only choirs that are available are the choirs of the shrill, demented shells, the wailing shells, and the poem saying any other form of orison or any other form of choir would be a mockery. No mockery is now for them. Okay, so that's, roughly speaking, what's going on. Now, in the novel, Sassoon is made to point out that the poem is contradictory. And Owen responds by showing that a poem of Sassoon's is similarly contradictory. Because the octet denies comfort to the war dead. It says there's basically no comfort for the war dead. Their only comfort is the rattle of the rifles and the stutter of the rifles and the pattering orisons of weaponry. The sestet, however, refers to forms of comfort that are available to speed them all. Those forms of comfort are not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbye. So, if you like, the comfort of what we call it, comradeship. And then the other one is the pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall. They get a pall after all, and it's in the pallor of girls' brows. Their flowers, the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk are drawing down of blinds. So you get those images of, well, I read as being rather sexualized, images of deprivation and renunciation and frustration of the girls, right, who are losing their boyfriends. While the boys are losing their boyfriends too. Again, you have to be fairly perverse probably to read that much sexuality into this kind of Edwardian lexicon, but there you go, that's what they pay me for. So that's why Sassoon says the poem is contradictory, okay? Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's also something in the sensitive versus object, right?
That's right. That's right, yeah. The candles substitute immediately for the bugles, right? Next line from the bugles. And the glimmers replace the stutter of the rifles. Absolutely right, yeah. And in that way the poem is building its unity back against that. It's building kind of formal unity back against the contradictoriness that Sassoon points to. But see, I don't think it's really a contradiction. I think it's more of an equivocation. And I think it's an equivocation because this is a poem that wants to be about the war, but has to be about the elegy. It has to be, in some sense, recognizable as an elegy. Right? And so it's the compromise that it makes, or the compromise that it represents, enables the poem to hijack the elegy for the purpose of witnessing the war, but requires at the same time that it acknowledge the generic nature of the elegy to a certain extent, which is what it does in its in the sestet in particular, when it goes back on what it said about the passing bells and introduces the candles and the glimmers of goodbyes and the drawing down of blinds and the more conventional signs of mourning in its place. So that the ground of the equivocation here would be in a double picture of the damage done by war. War damage is material entropy, if you like, represented by the disorderly onomatopoeic language, rattles and patters, distress, anger, those kinds of things. But war is also human deprivation, which is what the sextet is about. And since the thematic core of the poem is saying, what passing bells for those who die cattle? Only the war is a passing bell for those who die as cattle. It regains a semblance of logic by saying only the war, which is two things. It's the noise and rattle, it's the candles and the glimmers and the pallor. Both of those things are war. But those are the only. Okay. So you see why I hesitate about whether to describe this as an equivocation, because it is kind of equivocation, or whether to describe it as a compromise formation. And I'm not sure whether there's any difference anyway between a compromise formation and an equivocation when you get to the end. Okay, I'm nearly done. We may have 10 minutes. The sestet also, I think, crosses a boundary between the setting of the first 11 lines of the sonnet, which is at the front. The weaponry of war, then the holy glimmers of goodbyes in the eyes of the boys, who have to be understood as the soldiers' comrades still alive. So that's the setting for that is the front, and then the domestic setting that's implied by the pallor of girls' brows and the lowering of blinds. And this is back home all of a sudden. So if you segment the poem differently than the sonnet structure requires, and read it as 11 lines against 3, you have a structure, I guess it is. You have a movement, anyway, lovely French word, mouvement. The mouvement du poème is great equivocation all in its own right. The movement of the poem, which moves from the war to home, enacts a crossing of the border of the edge between the front, between France, if you like, and England. So it's as if the poem was enacting something that happened on the east coast of England during the war, which was that you could hear the guns from France. If you stood on the shoreline of England, when the weather was right, you could hear the guns. So the poem is bringing the war also onto the domestic front of England, okay? And in that sense, constituting a message from beyond the edge, right? The edge being, in this case, the English Channel, if you like. Now I say that because I wouldn't have noticed that point. I can see you're sort of skeptical about it, but that's okay. I wouldn't have noticed that point if it wasn't that Pat Parker makes Sassoon sensitive to it in the novel, because, as you remember, it's in discussing this poem, working with the poem with Owen, that Sassoon hears a tapping at the window. Excuse me while I find the page here. I'm a bit lost in my own notes here. 142. Okay, top of the page. What passing bells for these who die so fast? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Well, there's nothing wrong with the second line. In herds, better. They worked on the poem for half an hour. The wind had been rising all evening, and the thin curtain billowed in the draught. At one point, Sassoon looked up and said, "What's that noise?" Wind. Owen was trying to find the precise word for the sound of shells, and the wind was a distraction he'd been trying to ignore. No, that. Owen listened. I can't hear anything. That tapping. Owen listened again. No. Must be imagining things. Sassoon listened again and said, "They don't wail, they hiss." No, these are going right over. That's right, they hiss. I hear hissing. You hear tapping, says Owen, right? So there's an intricate networking, interdigitation of some kind going on between the sounds of the war that they're trying to introduce into the poem and the tapping that Sassoon hears in his head while they're doing the working, because that tapping is the preliminary sign of the visitation, the hallucinatory visitation that Sassoon is about to receive from his dead soldier, Orm, who stands like death at the door. 143. He woke. Well, I'll read the previous paragraph. The windows banged and rattled. And again, in a brief lull, he thought he heard that. Okay, he's finished working on the poem. Now he's gone back to his room. There were no trees close enough to touch the glass. He supposed there might be rats, but then who ever heard of rats tapping? He tossed and turned, etc., etc. He woke to find Orm standing immediately inside the door, just come through the lintel, right across the threshold. He wasn't surprised. He assumed Orm had come to rouse him for his watch. What did surprise him a little was that he seemed to be in bed. So let's talk about Orm there, a memory of Sassoon's. He wanted to laugh now that his chest muscles didn't seem to work. After a while, he remembered that Orm was dead. This clearly didn't worry Orm. Okay, so the novel is saying is that the poem can be read as a visitation. It's a visitation from the other side of the border, other side of the edge, to the world of domesticity that's represented here physically. Okay, and that's enacted in this visitation by Orm. After a while, he remembered that Orm was dead. This clearly didn't worry Orm, who continued to stand quietly by the door, but Sassoon began to think it ought to worry him. Sassoon began to think that it ought to worry him. So, I'll extrapolate that the poem True has the same kind of address structure that Orm, quietly standing by the door, has. He's restrained, he's dignified, the text says. This is not a scary ghost, right? It's a very quiet, infiltrating ghost. That's a ghost. Who represents a reproach from the edge, from the other side of the edge, from beyond the Channel, from France, etc. And which is designed to induce anxiety and suspicion. Not for the poem to worry, it's for the readers to worry, just as Orm is not worried about being dead. Sassoon understands that it's for him to worry, as it's the receiver of Orm's message. And I would deduce that the historical success of poetry like this then, in its period, is a function of two things that basically I'll put under the heading of infiltrating. There's a nice book by a person called Mireille Rosello. In spite of her French name, is written in English. It's called Infiltrating Culture, published by Manchester University Press. So you'd be able to get it in Canada without problem, I would think. Hard to get in the United States for that reason. 1996, I believe. It's not about this stuff at all. It's essentially about Boer culture in contemporary France as a form of infiltration of the culture. The Boers are the second generation children educated in France, speaking metropolitan French and all the rest of it, of the first generation of North African immigrants. But I think poetry functions as an infiltration here, but it's witnessing poetry does, and that's why it has to be so gentle and mild and rewarding sounding. First of all, because as opposed to the Declaration, which was seen as a political threat, poetry is not seen as political. Poetry is seen as lyrical. Poetry in 1917 or 1918 or 1920 even is read. Poetry is widely read. We have to understand this is 1996, and we mustn't think that poetry is not something that people read. Educated, middle-class, literate people read a lot of poetry. I mean, these are the days when poetry was a staple of people's literacy. But they were educated, middle-class people, right? And so, not a political threat, if you see what I'm saying. Poetry is associated with the home, with the living room, with privacy, with all of those kinds of things. Not political, and to the extent that it is political, it's middle-class political, and therefore it's not available to the dangerous working classes. Right? They're not the readers of poetry. They can't read. And if they could read, they can't read poetry, among other things, because they've never gone to prep school and public school in English sense, and had Latin and Greek meters whipped into them, and that lovely education that made empire builders. It's something for which Canadians and Australians have to be eternally grateful. Although many Australians would go to describe their ascendancy in terms of the wild and dangerous working class Irish just the same. Okay, so there's that generic status of poetry in the period which makes it available, where a political statement like the Declaration is just going to be squashed. Second point, there's the kind of generic disguise, what I call generic hijacking. Not only is it poetry, but it's poetry that requires poetry of indirection that requires reading if you're going to get any sense of what it is really about. Okay, you have to sit there and provide an effort of imagination. And the way that it eludes cultural censorship, therefore, is through the readerly imagination. Nobody has to say anything. You just have to sit there and think. Okay? And think about, for example, not even the stresses and strains and war and horrors of the war, but about what it really means to talk about the power of girls' brows. Sexual frustrations. Yeah, right on the spot, on the home. You just have to sit and think what is really being talked about. And then the thing works. So, there's a model of infiltration, which I think is important. And we can now see, going back to Eric Michaels' stuff, that he too was working with an infiltratory model of witnessing as a cultural practice when he decided that he would go for a cult readership, a readership of about 500 people in the first place, and then processing this hope like hell that the the interface between that cult readership and the wider readership would work. And it did in his case, because here were we, not part of the cult readership, talking about it in an American edition last week, and here we are again, somewhat under my impulsion, I admit. Probably wouldn't have arisen spontaneously, talking about the poetry of Siegfried and Wilfrid. Is this poetry read in Canada? It's not read at all in the United States, as near as I can find out.
Used to be, in the 70s especially, I think, when the forced it was followed by the
And he still lives in high school. That's when you don't hear.
Yeah.
That beautiful poem by Owen about a mouth around the apple, a boy.
Oh yes, yeah. Okay, yeah. So there's probably a British cultural tradition at work here, because when I was a college student, the course on modern poetry started with poetry in general, on rubric book as well as and it still felt modern in those. It felt modernish to me in those days. In the 1950s.
A comment that we also produced John McRae, the Flanders Fields, and recently there was I remember the details, there was something in the business of his medals or something went up for auction.
Right.
And,
Family.
and there was quite a controversy over this.
Yeah.
And apparently an industrialist or something stepped in, bought them, and then donated them to the museum. But there was this controversy over whether they were out of public domain into private collectors.
I'll look into that. Yeah. I think if I was going to write a book about war poetry, this war poetry, 1914-18 war poetry, I would want to stress something that I haven't mentioned at all today, and that would be its interface with another kind of poetry of war, which is much more, sentimental. I know, refer to Flanders Fields as being a bit sentimental, and also more celebratory of the war. The emblem for it would be the difference between German. The difference between Remarque's book, Westen nicht Neues, or quite on the Western Front, and Ernst Jünger's war memoir, which is called In the Storm of Steel, I think is the English title, Im Stahlgewitter. And Jünger is infuriating to read, I suppose is the way to put it, because he recognises the pain and the anguish of the war, but he has a ready-made kind of Juncker ideology of honour that gets him through. And then you have Apollinaire in France. You have the big Apollinaire problem in France, this futurist writing, pseudo-futurist writing, poetically extremely inventive, but a celebration of the battlefield as a stimulus to the senses. Basically, all of that stuff was going on, and this witnessing writing has to find a place for itself in that general kind of literary spectrum of writing about the war. I would put Balbus and Remarque and the English war poets in one camp, and the other poets in the other texts in another camp. But there's lots of connections between the two. Yeah. I think so, yeah. No, I don't think it's a problem, but I think it's something that you need to face up to as being about the conditions of existence of witnessing. But I think conditions of, when there's telling us something, I think, witnessing literature doesn't exist in a vacuum, either a generic vacuum in terms of other forms of literature, or a social vacuum, and those things all have to be taken into account, historicised and understood best we can. Yes.
I think it's also interesting to get the juxtaposition between the two fronts, and this poem well read the second part is much more Edwardian. And then there's two forms of witnessing. One is the witnessing directly at the front, first part of the poem, but then when we do Soldiers to England and the Power of Girls' Brows, drawing down to the blinds, it almost seems as though that portion of the poem is more lyric, as though we moved from it, and it hasn't infiltrated completely to that front. So that there's still sort of this sense of romanticized concept of what you find. Well, because when one thinks of the Power of Girls' Brows, that's 19th century concept of the damsel in distress.
At the same time, though, I think it would appear to me it goes hand in hand with what you're saying about the silence, where when the men look at one another, that's when they become mute. They cannot express to one another what's happening. And then when they get home, silence rings. And this is what those and it's like the sonnet is breaking to pieces. That's why you can't put those two things together. It gives you a new notion of what a sonnet's about. In fact, the sestet and the octet, they don't go together anymore. One is a repressive silence, although it seems so nice, these pallor of these brows. And it's exactly this 19th century kind of comedy. If I read it through what you're saying properly.
Well, the drawing down of blinds, when you do this calm stuff.
And the blinds.
Because, I mean, that's the first thing you see is...
That's right, so much an imposed discourse,
It's interesting that in the note that it mentions that Owen had silent there, and that Sassoon's final suggestion. But he substituted the word patient. And of course, I mean, this might be going too far, but I can't help but think of, well, they were both patients.
But silent patience. Until they could talk.
But it's that idea of patience and its connection to perhaps the whole thing shouldn't be patient.
But I think it's an implication of the concept of infiltration, that you always run the risk of disappearing into what you're infiltrating. In fact, you can't infiltrate without already beginning to disappear into what it is that you're infiltrating, and there's no obvious way of stopping that process, I suppose. So you can, as you say, disappear completely. And that's probably what happens a lot of the time.
Like Wolf's famous, I can't remember his name, some elaborate British name, in Mrs. Dalloway.
Oh, that was.
Septimus, he goes right into the vision and he doesn't come back out. He has the vision of the guy in the park, the ghost, and the fields and so on. But it fits nicely with your image there. The visionary comes, but then he's at least quiet, he goes away. His vision doesn't, and he goes into the vision, and as you say, it's not coming out, he disappears into madness. Have you looked at, would you use the wars as this? It just seems to, that business with the animals, how it begins to communicate with the animals, because he can't speak anymore. I've never thought of it that way, but listening to you talk to him.
I'll look into it. I don't know it.
Oh, it's hard. It's Timothy Finlay. He's a Canadian.
I know.
In World War I.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, he's the author of Not Wanted on the Voyage.
It's a really good book. My humble opinion is The Wars. And then his other stuff is very interesting, but it's not. I mean, The Wars is heart-stopping. It's unbelievable. Really? And the rest of the stuff, I mean, I don't think he's ever gone back to it.
I'm on my way to the bookstore now.
I'll photocopy it for you.
Any more comments? Problems, questions?
And/or difficulties.
Objections? See you next week.